What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? Story 1. The 24 hours before my dad died were a blur of frantic texts, unanswered calls, and the sterile, impersonal updates from the ICU nurses. The hospital's COVID restrictions barred us from being at his bedside, leaving me, my mom, and my sister to cling to the hope that he could hear our messages, even if he couldn't respond. When the call came at 3:30 a.m., the news was grim. He had passed quickly and quietly, alone in the ICU. By the time we were allowed to see him, he was already gone. His body still warm, but his spirit vanished. I held his hand, my tears falling onto the hospital sheets, and whispered my goodbye, hoping he could feel my presence one last time. The morning after his death, while my mom slept, exhausted from grief, I sat at the kitchen table with my dad's belongings. The hospital had returned his bag, and I sifted through it. His wallet, his watch, his phone. I hesitated before unlocking his phone, wanting to read the last words I'd sent him, to find some solace in the knowledge that he'd seen them. But when I opened his messages, my heart sank. None of our texts had been read. Not mine, not my mom's, not my sister's. Confusion turned to unease as I scrolled through his apps, searching for answers. That's when I found it. A chat app one didn't recognize. The name was unfamiliar, but the interface was simple, a messaging platform like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact, Emily. The messages were endless, stretching back months. Hourly updates, affectionate nicknames, declarations of love. My stomach churned as I read through them. He called her princess. He told her he loved her. She begged him to tell her what was happening, why he was in the ER, why he wasn't responding. The messages continued until just hours before his death. I scrolled back further, my hands trembling. The timeline was dangling. They'd been talking for nearly 2 years. Emily was young. Her messages were filled with the kind of innocence and naivety that made my skin crawl. I felt sick. Who was this girl? And why had my father chosen her over us in his final hours? The days that followed were a haze of grief and anger. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Who was she? How had my dad met her? And why had he kept her a secret? The questions gnawed at me, consuming my thoughts. Finally, I decided to find her. It didn't take long to track her down. Her social media profiles were public, and her posts painted a picture of a young woman barely out of high school. I sent her a direct message, my fingers shaking as I typed. At first, she didn't respond, but when she did, the truth came pouring out. Emily was 19. She had been 17 when they met. My dad had been her high school bus driver. She told me they'd been dating for almost 2 years, though she insisted it had never been physical, just emotional. She spoke of him with a mix of admiration and sorrow, calling him her best friend and the only person who ever understood her. I felt a wave of nausea. My dad, a 66-year-old man, had been romantically involved with a girl younger than his grandchildren. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Not only had he kept this secret from us, but he had chosen to spend his final moments communicating with her, not with the people who had loved him his entire life. The revelation shattered my family. My mom, already fragile from grief, was devastated. She couldn't understand how the man she'd been married to for over 40 years could have betrayed her so completely. My sister, always the peacemaker, tried to rationalize it, suggesting that maybe he'd been lonely, maybe he hadn't been in his right mind. But I couldn't let it go. The image of my dad as a loving, devoted husband and father was gone, replaced by the shadow of a man who had lied to everyone he claimed to love. The tension in our family grew unbearable. Arguments erupted over the smallest things, each one a proxy for the pain and anger we all felt. My mom withdrew, spending hours alone in her room, while my sister threw herself into work, avoiding the issue altogether. I, meanwhile, became obsessed with uncovering the truth. I dug through my dad's emails, his social media, even his bank statements, searching for any clue that might explain his actions. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. My dad hadn't just been talking to Emily. He'd been supporting her financially. Bank transfers, gifts, even payments for her college tuition. The money had come from a secret account, one my mom knew nothing about. As I pieced together the timeline, I realized he had been living a double life for years. But the most shocking discovery came when I found a series of emails between my dad and an old friend. In them, my dad confessed that he had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy and loneliness for years. He felt invisible, like he had spent his life playing a role, husband, father, provider, but never truly being seen. Meeting Emily had made him feel alive again, even if it was wrong. The emails painted a picture of a man who was deeply unhappy, who had spent decades burying his true self under layers of responsibility and expectation. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it made me see him in a new light. He wasn't just the villain in this story. He was a flawed, broken man who had made terrible choices. Armed with this new understanding, I called a family meeting. I shared everything I'd found, from the messages with Emily to the secret bank account to the emails. It was a painful, emotional conversation, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were all on the same page. My mom was heartbroken but also relieved. She had spent weeks blaming herself, wondering what she had done wrong. Knowing that my dad's actions were about his own insecurities, not her, gave her a sense of closure. My sister, too, seemed to soften, realizing that my dad's betrayal wasn't a reflection of how much he loved his family. In the months that followed, we tried to move forward. My mom started therapy, and my sister and I grew closer, leaning on each other for support. But the secret of Emily still weighed heavily on me. I couldn't forget the messages, the way he had called her princess, the way he had chosen her over us in his final hours. I thought about reaching out to Emily again, but I didn't. She was just a kid, caught up in something she couldn't possibly have understood. My dad was the one who had crossed the line, who had betrayed us all. And now, he was gone, leaving us to pick up the pieces of the life he had left behind. I still miss him. I miss the dad I thought he was, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who cheered me on at every school play, who held my hand when I was scared. But that man is gone, replaced by someone I'm still trying to understand. And maybe I never will. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried, even if they haunt you forever. Story 2. I grew up with a whimsical tale about my origins, a story of storks, stars, and magical lands. Even as a child, I sensed it was a fabrication, a comforting lie to shield me from a truth I wasn't ready to hear. At 57, the truth finally found me, unraveling the threads of my past and revealing a story far more complicated than I could have imagined. It started with a letter. A plain, unassuming envelope arrived in my mailbox one Tuesday morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a formal font. It was from a private investigator hired by someone I didn't know. The letter explained that my biological mother had passed away a year earlier, but before she died, she had left instructions for me to be found. She wanted me to know the truth. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. My adoptive parents had always been kind, but they'd taken their secrets to the grave. Now, here was a chance to uncover the story they'd kept from me. I called the investigator, and within weeks, I had the full picture. A college affair, a young Jewish man, a Baptist woman, and a love that was torn apart by prejudice and family pressure. The investigator gave me the address of the home where my mother had stayed during her pregnancy. It was a crumbling brick building in a small town, now abandoned and overgrown with ivy. I drove there one weekend, not sure what I was looking for but feeling drawn to the place nonetheless. As I walked through the empty halls, I imagined my mother as a young woman, scared and alone, carrying a child she knew she couldn't keep. I found an old ledger in what must have been the office, its pages yellowed and brittle. There, in faded ink, was her name, Margaret and Carter. And next to it, my name, the one she'd given me before I was taken away. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling a connection to her for the first time. But the moment was bittersweet. She was gone, and I would never hear her voice or see her face. Through the investigator, I learned I had 3 half-siblings on my father's side. They were all musicians, like me, a violinist, a cellist, and a pianist. We arranged to meet at a cafe in New York City, and from the moment we sat down, it felt like we'd known each other forever. We talked for hours, swapping stories and laughing at the strange quirks we all seemed to share. But there was one thing they told me that shook me to my core. Our father, the man who had fought to keep me all those years ago, was still alive. He lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn, alone and reclusive. They warned me that he didn't like to talk about the past, but I couldn't resist the urge to see him. I knocked on his door one rainy afternoon, my heart pounding in my chest. When he opened the door, I saw my own eyes staring back at me. He was an old man now, frail and stooped, but there was a fire in his gaze that hadn't dimmed with age. At first, he was hesitant to let me in. But when I showed him the ledger with my mother's name, his face softened. We sat in his cramped living room, surrounded by books and old photographs, and he told me the story I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. He spoke of my mother with such tenderness that it brought tears to my eyes. He told me how he'd followed her to the home, begging her to run away with him. But she was torn between her love for him and her faith, and in the end, she chose to let me go. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I couldn't bear to see you grow up in someone else's arms. It was easier to stay away." I left his apartment that day with a mix of emotions, gratitude for the love he'd shown me, but also a deep sadness for the life we might have had together. While I was piecing together my own story, I couldn't stop thinking about the other adoptee in my non-bio family, a woman named Clara. She was older than me, and her search for her birth mother had ended in tragedy. I decided to visit her, hoping to offer some comfort. Clara lived in a small, dimly lit apartment, her walls lined with shelves of books and records. She greeted me with a warm smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes that never quite went away. Over tea, she told me about her search for her mother, a woman who had been institutionalized her entire life. "She was born with so many disabilities," Clara said, her voice trembling. "And then, she was taken advantage of. I'm the result of that." I reached for her hand, feeling a surge of anger and helplessness. Clara had spent her life searching for answers, only to find a story of pain and injustice. But despite everything, she had found a way to move forward, channeling her emotions into her music and her art. A few months later, my half-siblings and I decided to organize a concert in honor of our shared father. We called it the Music of Our Blood, and it was held in a small, intimate venue in Brooklyn. My father agreed to come, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down his face as we played. Clara was there too, her presence a reminder that not all stories have happy endings. But as I looked out at the audience, I realized that our stories weren't just about the pain and loss. They were also about resilience, about finding beauty in the broken pieces. I still think about my mother often, wondering what kind of life we might have had if things had been different. But I've learned to carry her memory with me, like a song that plays softly in the background of my life. And as for my father, I visit him every now and then, sharing stories and music. He's still a private man, but there's a quiet understanding between us, a recognition of the love that was lost and the love that remains. Clara and I have grown closer, too, bound by the shared experience of searching for answers. We've both learned that the past can't be changed, but it can be carried with grace and dignity. In the end, our stories are not just about where we came from, but about who we choose to be. And for me, that's enough. Story 3. I never knew my grandmother's side of the family. Growing up, I only heard bits and pieces of her story, whispered like secrets too heavy to say out loud. But the one thing she told me, the one thing she made sure I knew, was this: I did the right thing. It wasn't until I was older that I understood what she meant. When my dad was just a baby, Grandma Clara lived in a small village, so remote it didn't even have a name on most maps. She was young, only 17, and her stepfather was a monster. She never said much about him, but the way her voice tightened when she mentioned him told me everything I needed to know. One night, he crossed a line, and in a moment of desperation, she stabbed him. She almost killed him, and then she ran. She took my dad, still just an infant, and left everything behind. The village, her mother, her siblings, all of it. She traveled for days, finally settling in a big city where no one knew her name. She never looked back. I remember asking her once, "Weren't you scared? Moving to a city where you didn't know anyone?" She just smiled, that sad, faraway smile she always had when she talked about the past. "I was more scared of staying," she said. The city was nothing like the village. It was loud and crowded, full of strangers and danger. Grandma found work as a seamstress, her hands always busy, always moving. She raised my dad alone, working long hours to make ends meet. But the city had its own kind of monsters. There was a man named Victor, a crime boss who ran the neighborhood where Grandma lived. He noticed her. How could he not? She was beautiful, even with the weight of the world on her shoulders. He started showing up at her work, offering her protection. When she refused, he made her life hell. His men would follow her home, slash her tires, leave threatening notes on her door. She never told my dad, not wanting to scare him. But I think she was terrified. One night, Victor's men cornered her in an alley. She fought back, just like she had all those years ago in the village. She escaped, but not without a scar, a thin, white line on her forearm that she traced absently when she thought no one was watching. Years passed, and Grandma built a life for herself and my dad. She never talked about the village or her family. As far as I knew, they didn't exist. But then, one day, a letter arrived. I remember the day clearly. Grandma was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held the envelope. The postmark was from a town near the village she'd left behind. Inside was a letter from her sister, Margot. Their mother was dying, and Margot begged Grandma to come home. "Please, Clara," the letter said. "She wants to see you one last time." Grandma didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the letter, her face unreadable. Finally, she looked at me and said, "I don't know if I can go back." Against her better judgment, Grandma decided to go. She took me with her. I was old enough to understand, she said, but not so old that I'd judge her. The journey was long, and with every mile, I could feel her anxiety growing. When we finally reached the village, it was like stepping into another world. The place was frozen in time, just as she'd left it. Margot was waiting for us at the edge of the village. She looked so much like Grandma, but softer, as if life hadn't been as hard on her. They embraced, and for the first time, I saw Grandma cry. The reunion with her mother was harder. The woman lying in the bed was frail and weak, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara," she said, reaching out a trembling hand. "I'm sorry." Grandma didn't say anything. She just sat by the bed, holding her mother's hand. But I could see the tears streaming down her face. That night, Margot told me the rest of the story. The stepfather wasn't just cruel, he was a predator. He'd been hurting Grandma for years, and no one had stopped him. The night she stabbed him, he'd turned his attention to her younger sister. That was the final straw. "She saved me," Margot said, her voice breaking, but she couldn't save herself. She had to leave, to protect your dad, and we let her go. I didn't know what to say. All I could think about was Grandma, carrying that weight alone for so many years. We stayed in the village for a week. Grandma spent most of her time with her mother, talking in hushed tones. I didn't ask what they said. It wasn't my place. But when it was time to leave, Grandma seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. On the way back to the city, I asked her, "Do you regret it? Leaving, I mean." She shook her head. "No," she said. "I did the right thing." And for the first time, I understood. She hadn't just been protecting herself or my dad. She'd been protecting all of us, from the pain, the secrets, the monsters that lurked in the shadows. She'd done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. Grandma passed away a few years later, but her story stayed with me. I never met her stepfather, and I'm glad I didn't. But I think about him sometimes, about the kind of man who could drive someone to do what she did. And I think about Grandma, strong and brave and unbroken. She did the right thing. And because of her, I'm here to tell her story. Story 4. When Mia convinced us to move back home, I was thrilled. She'd been my best friend for 7 years, my ride or die, my person. We'd been through breakups, family drama, and even the time I accidentally set her kitchen on fire trying to make macarons. She was family. So when she said, "Come back, I miss you," my husband and I looked at each other and said, "Why not?" We didn't have much tying us to the state we tried out, and honestly, I missed her too. The first few months back were magical. Mia was over almost every night for dinner. We'd laugh until our sides hurt, binge-watch terrible reality TV, and stay up way too late talking about everything and nothing. My husband, who's usually more reserved, even warmed up to her. He joked that she was the third roommate we never asked for but couldn't live without. It felt like we'd picked up right where we left off, and I was so happy to have my best friend back in my life. The first sign that something was off came after a small argument I had with my husband. It was nothing serious, just the usual bickering over who forgot to take out the trash. But later that night, Mia texted me out of the blue. "You deserve so much better than this. You're always putting in the effort, and he's just coasting. I hate seeing you upset." It was sweet, but also weird. I hadn't even told her about the fight. The next day, my husband mentioned that Mia had texted him too. "She said I was right and that you can be hard to deal with sometimes," he said, raising an eyebrow. I laughed it off, thinking maybe she was just trying to play peacemaker. But looking back, that was the first crack in the foundation. Things got stranger over the next few weeks. Mia started making little comments that felt off. One night, after my husband went to bed, she stayed up with me, sipping wine and talking. Out of nowhere, she said, "You know, if things don't work out with him, I've got a plan B for us. We could get a place together, just you and me. We'd be happy, I know it." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her expression was dead serious. I changed the subject, but the comment stuck with me. Then, a few days later, my husband told me Mia had brought up her infertility issues with him. "She said she wants a kid just like me," he said, looking uncomfortable. And then she asked if I'd ever consider being a sperm donor. My stomach dropped. That's when we started comparing notes. We realized Mia had been playing both sides. She'd been texting me about how my husband didn't appreciate me, while simultaneously telling him I was difficult and hinting at this bizarre fantasy of having a child with him. It was like she was trying to drive a wedge between us, while positioning herself as the solution to all our problems. We decided to confront her. I invited her over, and as soon as she walked in, I could tell she knew something was up. I started gently saying, "Mia, we need to talk. Some of the things you've been saying to us, they're not okay." At first, she denied everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. But when my husband pulled up the texts, her face went pale. She exploded. "You're twisting my words. I was just trying to help," she screamed. "You two are so ungrateful. I'm the one who's always been there for you, and this is how you repay me." It was like watching a switch flip. The Mia I knew, the funny, caring, loyal friend, was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. After the confrontation, things spiraled out of control. Mia started showing up at our house unannounced, banging on the door and demanding to be let in. She'd call and text constantly, alternating between angry rants and tearful apologies. "I can't lose you," she'd sob. "You're my family. You don't understand what you're doing to me." It got so bad that we started sleeping with the lights on, afraid she'd try to break in. One night, she left a box on our doorstep. Inside was a baby onesie and a note that said, "This could have been ours." I felt sick to my stomach. That's when we knew we had to get out. We packed up our lives in secret, terrified she'd find out and try to stop us. We moved to a new town, changed our phone numbers, and made sure no one knew where we were going. It was heartbreaking to leave our home, but we didn't feel like we had a choice. For months, I struggled with guilt and anger. How could someone I loved so much turn into this? I kept replaying our memories, wondering if there were signs I'd missed. But my husband reminded me that this wasn't my fault. "She wasn't the person you thought she was," he said. "And that's on her, not you." It's been a year since we left, and life is finally starting to feel normal again. My husband and I are closer than ever, and we've made new friends in our new town. But every now and then, I'll see something that reminds me of Mia, a song we used to sing at the top of our lungs, a recipe she taught me, and I'll feel a pang of sadness. I'll always cherish the good times we had, but I've come to terms with the fact that the Mia I knew is gone. What she did wasn't love, it was obsession. And while it's painful to lose someone who meant so much to me, I know we made the right choice. My husband and I are safe, and that's what matters most. Story 5. It was a quiet afternoon when I found it. I was in the attic, digging through old boxes for a photo album Dad had asked for. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old memories clung to everything. I wasn't expecting to find anything life-changing, just old pictures, maybe some childhood toys. But then I saw it, a faded envelope tucked inside my mom's old journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was in her handwriting, addressed to Uncle Mark, my godfather, the man who had been a constant presence in our lives for as long as I could remember. The words on the page were intimate, filled with longing and regret. My stomach churned as I read them. Mark, I can't keep pretending. Every time I see you, it's like a knife to my heart. I love him, but I love you too. What are we doing? I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. 20 years. 20 years. How could she? How could he? I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in my hands, my mind racing. I couldn't keep it to myself. I confronted her the next day when Dad was out running errands. She was in the kitchen, sipping coffee like nothing was wrong. Mom, we need to talk, I said, my voice shaking. She looked up, her smile fading when she saw the letter in my hand. Where did you get that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The attic. How long, Mom? How long has this been going on? She tried to deny it at first, but when I showed her the letter, she broke down. It was a mistake, she sobbed. It ended years ago. Please, you can't tell your father. It would destroy him. I wanted to scream. How could she sit there and beg me to keep her secret after everything she'd done? But part of me was terrified too. Dad adored her. He trusted her. If he found out, it would break him. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Mom tensed up whenever Uncle Mark came over. The way she avoided looking at him, making excuses to leave the room. And Dad, poor, clueless Dad, still treated Mark like a brother, inviting him over for Sunday dinners and golf outings like nothing was wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I started digging deeper, looking for answers. I found old photos of Mom and Mark together, hidden in the back of her closet. I saw cryptic text messages on her phone when she left it unattended. There was even a secret bank account she'd opened years ago. One night, after a particularly tense family dinner, I overheard my parents arguing in the kitchen. You've been so distant lately, Dad said, his voice tinged with frustration. I'm just stressed with work, Mom replied, her tone defensive. I wanted to burst in and tell him the truth, but I couldn't. Not yet. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I needed answers. I arranged to meet Uncle Mark at a coffee shop, my heart pounding the entire time. When I brought up the affair, his confident demeanor shattered. He looked like a man who'd been caught in a lie he'd been telling for decades. It was a mistake, he said, his voice low. I regret it every day. Please, don't tell your father. It would ruin everything. It already has, I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. How could you sit at our table all these years, pretending to be his friend? He didn't have an answer. The tension in our house became unbearable. Dad started noticing things too. Mom's nervousness, the way she avoided certain topics. One evening, he found an old photo of Mom and Mark hidden in a drawer. What is this? He asked, his voice shaking. Mom broke down and confessed everything. I'll never forget the look on Dad's face, like his entire world had just crumbled. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just packed a bag and left. I felt torn between them. Mom blamed me for not keeping her secret, while Dad retreated into silence, unable to process the betrayal. The family I'd known my whole life was falling apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. In the weeks that followed, Dad filed for divorce. Mom tried to reconcile, but he couldn't forgive her. Uncle Mark disappeared from our lives, cutting off all contact. The family gatherings I'd once loved became a thing of the past, replaced by awkward silences and unresolved pain. I struggled with my own guilt, wondering if I'd done the right thing by exposing the truth. Dad, though heartbroken, eventually thanked me for being honest with him. Living a lie would have been worse, he said one day, his voice heavy with emotion. Months passed, and slowly, we began to rebuild. Dad started therapy, working through his grief and anger. Mom sought counseling too, trying to understand why she'd made the choices she did. I found solace in talking to a trusted friend, who reminded me that the affair wasn't my fault. The truth had come at a great cost, but it also brought a sense of closure. Our family was forever changed, but there was hope for healing and forgiveness. As I watched Dad take small steps toward rebuilding his life, I realized that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. Story 6. I always wanted to be someone. Growing up, I felt invisible, overshadowed by my siblings, who seemed to excel at everything. I joined the Army Reserves at 18, hoping it would give me a sense of purpose. And for a while it did. I was good at leading people, at making decisions under pressure. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I needed more. One night, while working late in the recruitment office, I stumbled across a stack of job applications. Degrees, certifications, professional accolades, everything I didn't have. That's when the idea hit me. It started small. I copied the details of a medical degree from one applicant and a law degree from another. With a bit of Photoshop and some creative editing, I created my own credentials. I told myself it was just a one-time thing, a way to get a promotion, but it worked. And once it worked, I couldn't stop. Over the next decade, I built a life I could barely believe. I became a brigadier in the Army Reserves. I landed a CEO position at a major health fund. I married Emily, the most kind-hearted woman I'd ever met. She believed in me, admired my accomplishments. But every night, as I lay beside her, I felt the weight of my lies pressing down on me. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself I had no other choice. The first close call came during an audit at the health fund. The board wanted copies of my degrees for their records. My stomach dropped. I told them the documents had been lost in a flood at my old home. I paid a forger to create replicas, but he made a mistake. The law degree bore the name of a university that didn't even offer law programs. The board didn't notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living on borrowed time. Emily started to notice something was off. I'd always been vague about my past, but now I was downright evasive. One night, while I was away on a business trip, she found the locked drawer in my study. Inside were the forged documents, fake diplomas, transcripts, everything. When I got home, she confronted me. Her eyes were filled with tears, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "How could you lie to me, Jack? How could you lie to everyone?" I broke down. I told her everything. The stolen credentials, the forged documents, the years of deception. She gave me an ultimatum. Come clean or she would leave me. I promised her I would fix it, but deep down, I didn't know how. I decided to apply for a high-profile government role. I thought it would secure my legacy, silence my critics. But I didn't realize the recruitment team had implemented a new verification system. When they ran my credentials, red flags popped up everywhere. The universities I claimed to have attended had no record of me. My law degree was linked to a known forgery ring. I tried to withdraw my application, but it was too late. Government applications are treated as statutory declarations. You can't just take them back. The recruitment team escalated the matter to internal investigations. Within days, journalists were calling. My face was plastered across the front page of a national newspaper. The imposter brigadier, a life built on lies. The scandal exploded. The health fund launched an internal investigation, uncovering financial mismanagement during my tenure. The Army Reserve stripped me of my rank and launched a court-martial. Emily filed for divorce and took the kids. My once pristine reputation was in tatters. As the legal proceedings began, my past caught up with me in ways I couldn't have imagined. One of the applicants whose credentials I'd stolen years ago recognized me in the news and came forward. Another whistleblower revealed that I'd used my position in the reserves to help others falsify their qualifications for a fee. The prosecution built an airtight case. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, former colleagues, even strangers who'd followed the scandal in the news. I sat in the defendant's chair, my hands trembling. My defense attorney argued that my actions were driven by a desire to escape my humble beginnings and provide for my family. But the judge wasn't swayed. "You didn't just lie about your qualifications," the judge said, his voice cold and steady. "You betrayed the trust of every institution and individual who believed in you." I was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As I sat in my cell that first night, I thought about Emily, about the kids, about the life I'd thrown away. I wrote her a letter, apologizing for the pain I'd caused and vowing to rebuild my life honestly. I didn't know if she'd ever forgive me, but I had to try. After serving my sentence, I struggled to reintegrate into society. My criminal record made it nearly impossible to find work, and I was ostracized by former colleagues. I eventually found a job as a mortuary assistant, the only role I was truly qualified for. It was humbling, but it gave me a sense of purpose. One day, while preparing a body for burial, I recognized the deceased. It was one of the applicants whose credentials I'd stolen years ago. Overcome with guilt, I attended the funeral anonymously, leaving a single white rose on the grave. It was a small act of penance, but it marked the beginning of my long journey toward redemption. Story 7. When my grandfather passed away at the age of 87, I thought I knew everything about him. Joseph Carter was the kind of man who seemed larger than life. A devoted husband to my grandmother for over 50 years, a loving father to my mom and her siblings, and the kind of grandfather who always had a story to tell and a pocket full of candies to share. He was a normal guy, or so I thought. He paid his taxes, had a driver's license, and even voted in every election. But when he died, we discovered something that turned our world upside down. Joseph Carter didn't exist. At first, it seemed like a mistake. My mom was handling the paperwork after his death, and she called me one evening, her voice shaky. "They can't find his records," she said. "No birth certificate, no social security number, nothing. It's like he was never born." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was some bureaucratic mix-up, but as the days went by, the truth became harder to ignore. The man we called Grandpa was a ghost. A week after the funeral, we were cleaning out his study, a small, cluttered room filled with old books, yellowed newspapers, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. That's when I found it. A small, locked metal box tucked away in the back of his closet. It was heavy, with a combination lock that hadn't been touched in years. I called my mom and grandma into the room, and we all stared at it like it was some kind of treasure chest. "Do you know what's inside?" I asked Grandma. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Joseph always said that box was private. He never opened it in front of me." My mom, ever practical, suggested we break it open, but Grandma stopped her. "No," she said firmly. "If Joseph wanted it locked, there's a reason. We need to respect that." I couldn't stop thinking about the box. It felt like the key to everything, like it held the answers to who Grandpa really was. A few days later, Grandma called me. "I found something," she said. "A slip of paper in his old wallet. It has numbers on it. Maybe it's the combination." We gathered in the study again, the box sitting on the desk like a silent witness. My hands trembled as I turned the dial, following the numbers on the slip of paper. The lock clicked open. Inside, there were a few items: a faded photograph, a stack of foreign currency, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The photograph was the most striking. It showed a young man who looked unmistakably like Grandpa, but he was dressed in a military uniform I didn't recognize. On the back, someone had written a name: Alexander Ivanov, 1945. "Alexander Ivanov," my mom whispered. "Who is that?" Grandma looked pale. "That's your father," she said, pointing to the man in the photo. "But that's not the name I knew him by." The leather-bound notebook was filled with handwritten entries in a language none of us could read. It looked like Russian, but we weren't sure. There were also sketches, maps, buildings, and what looked like blueprints. At the back of the notebook, we found a folded piece of paper with a list of names and dates. Some of the names were crossed out. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Was Grandpa a spy? My mom shook her head, but she didn't look convinced. "I don't know, but this doesn't make sense. He was just a mechanic. He worked at the same garage for 30 years. How could he have been involved in something like this?" A few days later, a man showed up at our door. He was tall, with sharp features and a thick accent. "I'm looking for Joseph Carter," he said. "I heard he passed away." I exchanged a glance with my mom. "Yes, he did," she said cautiously. "Can I ask who you are?" The man hesitated. "My name is Victor. I was a friend of his. From a long time ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just a friend. My mom invited him in, and we sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. "Your father," Victor began, was not who you think he was. He was a hero. During the war, he worked for a certain organization. He had to disappear, to take on a new identity. It was the only way to protect himself and his family. What organization? I asked, my heart pounding. Victor leaned forward, his eyes dark and serious. That's not something I can discuss. But know this, your grandfather was a good man. He did what he had to do to keep you all safe. After Victor left, we were left with more questions than answers. Who was Alexander Ivanov? What had Grandpa done during the war? And why had he kept it a secret for so long? We decided to hire a private investigator to help us piece together the puzzle. What we discovered was both shocking and heartbreaking. Grandpa had been part of a resistance group during World War II, working against the Nazis in Eastern Europe. After the war, he had been targeted by Soviet intelligence for reasons we still didn't fully understand. He had fled to the United States, assumed a new identity, and built a life from scratch. But the past had never truly left him. The names in his notebook, the foreign currency, the photograph, they were all remnants of a life he had tried to leave behind. And now, decades later, the truth had finally caught up with him. The most shocking discovery came last. Buried in the notebook was a letter addressed to my grandmother. In it, Grandpa, or Alexander, apologized for the lies and explained why he had kept his past hidden. I did it to protect you, he wrote, to give you a life free from the shadows of my past. I hope one day you can forgive me. Reading those words, I finally understood. Grandpa hadn't been lying to us. He had been protecting us. And in doing so, he had given us the greatest gift of all, a normal life. Today, I keep the locked box on my desk as a reminder of the man I thought I knew, and the man he really was. Joseph Carter, Alexander Ivanov, whoever he was my grandfather. And in the end, that's all that matters. Story 8. For years, your mother, Margaret, had cherished the birthday cards sent by her parents. Each card contained a crisp bill or two, accompanied by heartfelt notes. Over time, she amassed a small collection, not for the money but for the sentimental value. The cards were a tangible connection to her late parents, and she dreamed of one day using the savings to buy a piano, a lifelong dream she had put on hold for her family. One afternoon, while organizing her closet, Margaret noticed the shoebox where she kept the cards was missing. Panic set in. She searched the house frantically, her heart sinking as she realized the box was gone. The only person who had been in her room recently was your sister, Emily. Emily had a history of stealing from family members, cash from wallets, jewelry, even small heirlooms. Confronting her was always a battle, as Emily was a master of deflection and denial. This time, however, Margaret was determined to get the cards back, even if it meant escalating the conflict. Margaret confronted Emily in the living room, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. Emily, did you take the box of cards from my closet? Emily, lounging on the couch with her phone in hand, didn't even look up. What cards? I don't know what you're talking about. Margaret's frustration boiled over. Don't play dumb with me. Those cards were from your grandparents. They're all I have left of them. I don't care about the money. Just give me the cards back. Emily rolled her eyes. I didn't take anything. Maybe you lost them. You're always misplacing stuff. The argument escalated, with Margaret accusing Emily of lying and Emily firing back with accusations of favoritism and neglect. The tension between them had been building for years, and this incident was the breaking point. Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret enlisted your help. Together, you searched Emily's room while she was out. Hidden under a pile of clothes in her closet, you found the shoebox, empty. The cards were gone, and so was the money. Margaret was devastated. Why would she do this? Those cards meant everything to me. You decided to dig deeper. You reached out to Emily's friends, hoping to piece together what had happened. One of them, Jenna, reluctantly admitted that Emily had been flashing cash recently, bragging about a big score. When pressed, Jenna revealed that Emily had sold the cards and money to a pawnshop downtown. Margaret and you rushed to the pawnshop, hoping to recover the cards. The owner, a gruff man named Frank, confirmed that Emily had sold him a box of old cards and cash a few days ago. She said they were hers, Frank explained. I didn't ask questions. Margaret pleaded with him to return the cards, offering to pay whatever it took. Frank agreed, but only if she reimbursed him for the money he had given Emily. Reluctantly, Margaret paid the amount, clutching the box of cards tightly as you left the shop. Back at home, Margaret confronted Emily again, this time with the evidence. I know you sold the cards to the pawn shop. How could you do this to me? Emily's facade cracked. I needed the money, okay? You don't understand what it's like to struggle. Margaret's voice was cold. Struggle? You live under my roof, eat my food, and steal from your own family. Those cards were the last thing I had of my parents. You took that from me. Emily stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The house felt emptier than ever. In the weeks that followed, the family dynamic shifted. Margaret, heartbroken but resolute, decided to set stricter boundaries with Emily. She began therapy to process her grief and the betrayal, slowly rebuilding her sense of self. Emily, meanwhile, spiraled further. Without the safety net of her family's forgiveness, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. She moved out, cutting ties with the family entirely. Margaret eventually saved enough money to buy the piano she had always wanted. It became a symbol of her resilience, a way to honor her parents' memory and reclaim her joy. Months later, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from Emily. Inside was a handwritten note and a single birthday card, the first one her parents had ever given her. Emily's note was brief. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much those cards meant to you. I found this one in my bag and thought you should have it back. I'm trying to be better. Maybe one day, I'll deserve your forgiveness. Margaret held the card to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The piano sat in the corner of the living room, its polished surface reflecting the sunlight. Margaret played a simple melody, her fingers dancing across the keys. The music filled the house, a reminder that even after loss and betrayal, there was still beauty to be found. And somewhere out there, Emily was learning to play her own tune. Story 9. Got it. Let's rewrite the story in first-person style from Ellie's perspective, adding more depth, drama, and emotional weight. Here's how it unfolds. My name is Eleanor Hawthorne, but everyone calls me Ellie. I've always been good at getting what I want. Some people call it charm. Others call it cunning. I suppose it's a bit of both. But what I did, what I'm about to tell you, wasn't just cunning. It was desperate, and it was dangerous. It all started with James. Captain James Whitaker, Army man, straight-backed and serious as a heart attack. He was my first. We married young, and I thought he'd be my forever. But forever didn't last long. He was deployed more often than he was home, and the loneliness ate at me. That's when I met Sam. Lieutenant Samuel Calloway, Navy pilot, with a grin that could melt ice and a daredevil streak that made my heart race. He swept me off my feet, and before I knew it, I was saying I do again. Then there was Danny. Sergeant Daniel O'Malley, Marine, all muscle and heart. He was different from the others, softer, kinder, and he looked at me like I hung the moon. I couldn't help myself. I married him too. For years, I juggled them all. James sent his paycheck from Fort Bragg, Sam from Norfolk, and Danny from Camp Lejeune. I told myself I was just surviving, making the best of a bad situation. But deep down, I knew I was playing with fire. The first crack in my carefully constructed world came when James showed up unannounced. He'd been discharged early, something about an old injury. I was at the cottage we shared, or used to share, when he walked in. The look on his face when he saw the dust-covered furniture and empty rooms was like a knife to my chest. Ellie, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Where have you been? I stammered out some excuse about staying with a sick friend, but he wasn't buying it. He followed me to the little house on the outskirts of town, the one I shared with Sam. And that's when it all fell apart. Sam was supposed to be on deployment, but he'd gotten leave after a close call during a training exercise. He'd come home to surprise me, just like James. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door open. My heart stopped when I saw James standing there, his face a mask of fury. Behind him was Sam, holding a bouquet of roses, his smile fading as he took in the scene. Who the hell is this? James growled, stepping towards Sam. Sam's eyes narrowed. I could ask you the same question. I tried to intervene, but it was too late. The two of them were shouting, their voices echoing through the house. Neighbors started gathering outside, drawn by the commotion. And then, as if the universe had decided to punish me all at once, Danny's truck pulled into the driveway. Danny stepped out, his uniform crisp, his face lighting up when he saw me. But that light faded fast when he noticed James and Sam, their faces red with anger. Ellie, Danny said, his voice trembling. What's going on? I couldn't speak. My throat closed up, and tears streamed down my face. The three of them stood there, staring at each other, then at me. The truth was written all over my face, and there was no hiding it anymore. You've got to be kidding me, James said, his voice like ice. All this time? Sam threw the roses on the ground. You've been playing us this whole time? Danny just looked at me, his eyes filled with hurt. Ellie, why? I wanted to explain, to tell them how lonely I'd been, how scared. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sank to my knees, sobbing. The men I'd loved, the men I'd betrayed, stood over me, their anger and pain palpable. The scandal tore through Willow Creek like a wildfire. I became the town pariah, the woman who duped 3 military men. James, Sam, and Danny left town, each vowing never to speak to me again. The money dried up, and I was left with nothing but my guilt. But the worst part wasn't the shame or the loneliness. It was the realization that I'd hurt the people I cared about most. James, Sam, and Danny weren't just paychecks to me. They were my heart, my soul, and my downfall. Now, I live alone in the little house on the outskirts of town, haunted by the choices I made. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to forgive myself. But deep down, I know the truth. Some mistakes are too big to undo. And some hearts, once broken, can never be put back together. Story 10. The night I overheard my parents' argument was the beginning of a series of events that would unravel the fragile fabric of our family. At the time, I was just a kid, too young to fully grasp the gravity of what had happened, but old enough to sense that something was deeply wrong. The silence that followed the argument was deafening, and it lingered in the house like a ghost, haunting every corner. The next morning, everything seemed normal. My parents acted as if nothing had happened, but the tension between them was palpable. My father, usually a man of few words, became even more withdrawn, while my mother's smile seemed forced, her laughter hollow. I tried to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind, but it was like a splinter, festering beneath the surface. A few weeks later, I came home from school to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her eyes were red, and she looked as though she hadn't slept in days. When I asked her if she was okay, she forced a smile and told me she was just tired. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She was drowning in something she couldn't escape. That evening, my father came home late, smelling of alcohol. He stumbled into the house, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. My mother didn't say a word as he made his way to the living room and collapsed onto the couch. I watched from the hallway as she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of anger and despair. She didn't yell, didn't scream. She just stood there, silently watching him, as if she were trying to decide whether to walk away or set the whole house on fire. The tension between them continued to build, like a storm gathering on the horizon. There were more arguments, more silences, more nights where I would lie in bed, listening to the sound of their voices through the walls. Each time, I would hold my breath, waiting for the explosion that never came. But the quiet was almost worse. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with things that could never be taken back. One night, the storm finally broke. I was woken by the sound of shattering glass. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see my mother standing in the middle of the room, her hands trembling as she held a piece of broken glass. My father was on the other side of the room, his face pale, his hands raised as if to protect himself. "Do it," he said. his voice barely above a whisper. If that's what you want, just do it. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, it looked like she might actually do it. But then she dropped the glass and sank to the floor, sobbing. My father hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and kneeling beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she cried. I stood in the doorway, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run to them, to tell them that everything would be okay. But another part of me knew that it wouldn't, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. They told me that they were going to try to work things out, that they loved each other, and wanted to make our family whole again. I wanted to believe them, but the look in their eyes told me that they were just as scared as I was. Over the next few months, things seemed to improve. My parents went to counseling, and there were fewer arguments, fewer silences. But the scars were still there, hidden beneath the surface. I could see it in the way my mother would sometimes flinch when my father raised his voice, or the way my father would avoid her gaze when they thought I wasn't looking. Then, one night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. I was about to walk in when I heard my mother say something that made me stop in my tracks. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I love you, but I don't know if that's enough." There was a long silence, and then my father spoke, his voice barely audible. "I know," he said, "but we have to try. For him." I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized they were talking about me. I wanted to burst into the room and tell them that they didn't have to stay together for my sake, that I would be okay. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, listening as they talked about their fears, their regrets, their hopes for the future. In the end, they decided to stay together. They continued to go to counseling, to work on their relationship, and slowly, things began to change. The arguments became less frequent, the silences less heavy. There were still moments of tension, moments when I could see the cracks in their relationship, but they were trying, and that was enough. Years later, when I was old enough to understand, my mother told me the whole story. She told me about the night she had tried to shoot my father, about the guilt and the shame she had carried with her ever since. She told me how they had both been broken, how they had both made mistakes, but how they had chosen to stay together, to fight for each other and for our family. Story 11. The discovery of my brother's betrayal began with a phone call from the bank. The voice on the other end was polite but concerned, asking why my father's mortgage payments had been missed for 6 months. My stomach dropped as I listened, my mind racing. How could this have happened? My father, who had been diagnosed with dementia a year earlier, was no longer capable of managing his finances, and I had trusted my brother to handle things. But as I dug deeper, the truth began to unravel, and the betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. When I checked my father's bank account, I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me. The account was in the negative, drained of funds that should have been used to pay his bills and care for his needs. I confronted my brother, my voice shaking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. His response was callous, almost flippant. "Well, I gotta pay my bills." The words hung in the air like a slap, and I realized then that my brother had been stealing from our father for months, maybe longer. I immediately began the process of taking control of my father's accounts, determined to stop the bleeding and ensure that his needs were met. But before I could fully intervene, my father's health took a sudden turn for the worse. He was rushed to the hospital, his frail body unable to fight off the infection that had taken hold. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, feeling the weight of guilt and regret. I should have been more vigilant. I should have seen the signs sooner. My father passed away a few days later, leaving a void that felt impossible to fill. In the aftermath of his death, I was forced to confront the full extent of my brother's actions. As I sorted through my father's affairs, I discovered that my brother had not only drained his bank account, but had also stolen a portion of my inheritance. The amount totaled over $5,000, money that had been meant to honor my father's wishes and provide for his children. Instead, it had been squandered, stolen by someone who was supposed to protect him. The betrayal was a wound that refused to heal. I tried to reason with my brother, to make him understand the gravity of what he had done, but he was unrepentant. He shrugged off my anger, dismissing it as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "It's just money," he he said, his tone indifferent. Dad wouldn't have cared, but I cared. I cared deeply. The money wasn't just about finances. It was about trust, about respect, about the love and care that my father had deserved in his final days. My brother's actions had robbed him of that, and they had robbed me of the chance to say goodbye without the shadow of betrayal hanging over us. As the weeks turned into months, the rift between my brother and me grew wider. Family gatherings became tense, awkward affairs, filled with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. My brother continued to live his life as if nothing had happened, while I struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. I considered legal action, but the thought of dragging my family through a public battle was more than I could bear. Instead, I focused on honoring my father's memory in my own way, ensuring that his legacy was preserved despite the damage that had been done. In the end, the theft of the money was just one part of a larger story, a story of greed, of broken trust, of a family fractured by betrayal. My brother's actions had left a scar that would never fully heal, a reminder of the fragility of relationships and the lengths to which some people will go to serve their own interests. But amidst the pain and anger, there was also a lesson, that even in the face of betrayal, it is possible to find strength, to honor the memory of those we love, and to move forward with integrity and grace.